Hi everybody, this is Brendon Baillod from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. I have a really good presentation that I've put together that I'd like to share with everybody tonight about the history of Great Lakes vessel photography. This is a presentation I've been thinking about doing for a long time because, as many of you know, I'm an avid collector of early Great Lakes vessel photos. And, I spent many years learning about it, and I know there are a number of other collectors out there, and I frequently get questions from people about how old is this photo? Does a photo of this ship exist? Particularly of new shipwreck discoveries. They want to know if schooners have been photographed. Oftentimes I get questions if a vessel from the 1840s or 1850s has been photographed, and my answer is always no, it hasn't. But in truth, there were some early photos, and I'd like to share some of those with you, and I'll walk you through the history of the technology used to make early photos, as well as when different types of photos came into being, and then I'll walk you through who some of the early collectors were on the lakes, some of the early photographers, and then some of the most important collections. So let's get on with it. Here we see one of the 5 earliest photos ever made of a Great Lakes vessel. This is the sidewheel steamer Michigan at Detroit. I'd say around 1858. This is a daguerreotype, a cased type of photo that was made really before the end of the Civil War. And I'll show you a number of these. This is a particularly nice view that's held by the by the Smithsonian Institute. It's a one of a kind. But what if you're looking for images of vessels before, say, the Civil War, before the 1850s even, 1840s, 1830s? What do we have available? Well, there are actually quite a few sources for fairly accurate paintings, line drawings, and folk art. One of the most important are the art books of Captain James Van Cleve. Van Cleve was an early Great Lakes sailor in the 1820s and 1830s, and he later became a fairly prominent shipping official on Lake Ontario. And after his retirement in the 1870s, he became quite an accomplished folk artist and made a series of art books of hundreds of excellent drawings of the vessels he actually saw with his own eyes and sailed on in the 1820s and 30s. A lot of data is in those books on the dimensions of vessels from Customs House records. Really an interesting resource. He made, I think, 5 or 6 different copies. The master is kept in Oswego, New York, at the courthouse where they guard it jealously. But there are also copies at the Buffalo and Erie Historical Society, the Chicago Historical Society. I think there's 1 or 2 in Detroit. And they are roughly equivalent to each other. And they're an excellent resource. This is an image here of the Chief Justice Robinson rendered in Van Cleve's inimitable style. I strongly encourage people to check those out if you haven't. I think Walt Lewis has a pretty good black and white copy of one of the Van Cleve books on his website. Well, if there are also some very accurate paintings that were done over the years, particularly in the early day. And there were a series in the 1830s of these sort of romanticized photos of lake ports. This is Detroit in 1837, showing the first Michigan, as well as a number of other really iconic early sidewheel steamers and early schooners, giving you an idea of what these early vessels looked like. And this was drawn fairly accurately, true to life. So, there aren't many of these, maybe a half a dozen that are available, and most people have seen them. I happen to have this one framed in my downstairs library. But there are a number of other sources too. One of my favorite are what I call launch paintings, and it's not a painting of the launch; it's a painting of the vessel right after she was launched. And these were done on the lakes by schooner builders and vessel owners beginning in the 1850s. And this is one of the earliest. This is the schooner Arabian, painted in 1853. And you can see the really finely executed drawings. They're done with great architectural detail and a lot of realism. Obviously, this was a schooner. 1853 is really too early to have many photos. But there are a number of these launch drawings and paintings. I'd say there's probably about 50 of these known, maybe up to 100 of them if you go up into the 1880s of schooners and steamers. Here's another really nice one of the big three-master Escanaba. This one was done probably 1870s, 1860s. You can see they all have in common sort of the stylized water and the really nice architectural detail. They're very well executed, and they give you a really good idea of what the vessel looked like, and kind of take the place in many ways of a photo, because the artist was actually looking at the vessel usually when he drew. There are a few other later drawings and paintings. This is a famous one by the artist Seth Arca Whipple, showing the tug Champion towing a raft of barkentines behind her past Detroit. This would have been late 1860s, early 1870s. But there are also a number of other fairly good what I would call vessel paintings by the artist V.D. Nickerson. He was fairly prolific in the late 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and also drew these sort of launch photos, but mostly of steamers, launch paintings of steamers. Nickerson's works are occasionally available for sale in original for not really high prices, maybe $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. You can own a actual 1870s or 1880s watercolor or ink paint or oil painting of a Great Lakes vessel. All right, what else do we have that's out there for vessels that weren't photographed? Well, probably the most famous source for really good line drawings of early Great Lakes vessels is Samuel Ward Stanton's epic work, American Steam Vessels. This was published in 1895, and Stanton was a very accomplished minuscule artist. What I mean by that is he did these very fine pen and ink drawings where he had these tiny little annotations. And you can see them here for the steamer Merchant, one of the iconic first iron-hulled vessels on the Great Lakes. She was built in 1862. She was not known to have been photographed until a Stereopticon View turned up about 10 years ago that I actually located myself and provided a copy to Pat Labadie, and I have another original stereo of it in my collection. But Stanton, of course, had the unique misfortune to book his passage back from a trip to Europe on the Titanic, and unfortunately we lost him well before his time. But his really rare book lives on and has beautiful drawings of a few hundred Great Lakes vessels. And lastly, Eric Heil, the Buffalo marine historian, did a series of excellent books containing hundreds of pencil drawings of Great Lakes vessels that were iconic or important. Between the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, he died, I think, in 1971. His collection is at the Historical Collections of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. But here you see his 6-volume set. You can still get some of these volumes. They're not cheap, $80 to $100 each. But it's an excellent set to own if you have a chance to get it. A lot of excellent drawings. He did them all from lithograph. So generally speaking, Heil had a reference that he was drawing from, usually a painting, a litho, or sometimes an early photo. All right. If we don't have a painting or a line drawing, there are a number of other interesting sources to see what early vessels look like. One are woodcut engravings. So the early illustrated newspapers, like Frank Leslie's and the London Illustrated, and etc., were beautiful woodcut engravings. And as you can see here, this is the propeller globe that exploded at Chicago in 1860. And what's interesting about this is that this woodcut and others were almost certainly made from a photo. There probably was an actual photo made of this, and then the artist made the woodcut by tracing the photo. So in almost every case that we know that a photo was made, but the photo has been lost in this case. So I've never seen it. I don't think it exists anymore, but we have this beautiful woodcut. We also have lithographs. Lithographs were really drawings that were pasted as though they were photos onto albumen. This is one of the Northern Transit Company steamers, and a really nice lithograph. And there are many of these that make the rounds on the Great Lakes, and they're highly collectible. A lot of times you'll see them on advertising materials. Here's another highly stylized woodcut of this the early Sidewheeler, Michigan, not the one from the daguerreotype that we led off with, but the one from the painting at Detroit. This was would be in about 1836. This particular woodcut comes from the J.W. Hall Marine Scrapbook, which is at Bowling Green State. And it shows her in a gale on Lake Huron. Very dramatic view. But it gives you an example of how they did this. This one they probably didn't have a photo of. The artist knew what the vessel looked like in life and then simply placed her in the medium. The last type of thing that we have is what's called a relief transfer. And this is a really good example of one. This is Kenosha, Wisconsin's harbor in 1856. This is from a letterhead. And there's an actual letter on it dated January 1857. And we know that this was also probably done from an original photograph. But what they did is they made an etching over the photo on glass and then printed the relief off the glass etching onto the paper. That was an early way of getting good detail using photographic quality, but allowing you to print it. And this would have been done prior to the inception of the ability to reproduce photos onto paper. So a relief transfer. This one here is the only known view of the schooner Colonel Glover, and then in the rear you see the C. Harrison, the schooner Caleb Harrison, a couple of very early vessels. I do wish we could identify that large brigantine on the left. All right. So I'm going to talk about some photographic terms because I'm going to take a little dive now into the technology. Before the 1820s, nobody had ever heard of a photograph. In 1827, the first actual photographic image was made, wherein an image was projected onto a chemically activated photographic plate, and the light reacted with the chemicals, creating an image. That was still largely in the laboratory until the 1840s. It wasn't until the early 1840s that the daguerreotype came into being, but then that was mostly something that was done in the studio by people with big bellows cameras that had a big black cloak and the big exploding flash, and it was not something that was done commonly outside to make landscapes really until the 1850s. What made it possible was something called the collodion process. And that was a process by which these chemicals could be bound onto a medium and then they would react with light. In the case of the daguerreotype, it was a copper plate. They also had a medium called the tin type, which was a tin plate, and then the ambrotype, which was made on glass. There was also something called a cyanotype, which you may hear of it from time to time, which was much later. And it simply used chemicals that turned the image blue. They were often used to make blueprints, but if you ever see a blue tinted photo, that's a cyanotype. They were common throughout the later 1800s. So these daguerreotype, tin type, and ambrotype have two things in common. They were all cased views. They're all inside of usually a case made of metal or of gutta percha, which was like a bakelite type substance made from trees. And they also were one-offs. If you had a daguerreotype or a tin type or an ambrotype, there were no other copies of it because you couldn't make them unless the photographer, took another exposure. It wasn't until really after the Civil War that people started to find ways to, transfer photos and to reproduce them. It started with glass plate negatives, which started to be made during the Civil War. And they gave birth to a brand new type of photo that became very popular called the Stereopticon View. It was done with a camera that had two apertures, roughly as far apart as the human eyes, and each one had a glass plate in it. And then they would take the photo, the exposure, and print them onto albumen paper and glue those onto cardstock. Actually around the same time, another medium called the carte de viste was invented. That was really similar. It just was done with a single camera, and they would make a small photo. I think it was only about 2 by 4 inches, and they would also print that onto a glass plate and then use albumen paper to make many copies off that glass plate. They would glue that albumin paper onto cardstock. And that later gave birth to something called the cabinet card photo, which was just a larger version. And then they had other views called imperial views that were even larger than that. But what they had in common is they were all made from glass plate negatives, where they were printed onto albumin paper and then glued onto cardstock. Those are called a contact print. One of the downsides, of course, is that they eventually degraded the original negative. And so the difference between Stereopticon views and these different cardstock things like a CDV or a cabinet card are that cabinet cards and CDVs were most often made in the studio, and they were used for portraits. You see many of these with pictures of people. Stereopticon views were mostly made for mass production and to be sold to the public, and they were mostly of outdoor views, landscapes, buildings, harbors, boats. And so, even though we do have some CDVs and some cabinet card views of Great Lakes vessels, most of the early views we have, post-Civil War and up to the 1880s, come from Stereopticon views. They are, if you go into the Labadie database, or one of these, Great Lakes vessel photo collections of vessel photos from the 1800s, that's mostly what we have there, are individual panels from Stereopticon views. So it wasn't until the 1880s, really, that we moved away from glass plate negatives. Eastman Kodak invented the gelatin silver print film, essentially, on paper stock. And it was not terribly common until really the turn of the century. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So that's a little history. That'll tell you a little bit more about some of the things I'm going to show you and talk about. All right. So the first Great Lakes photo known is before you here. It's not widely known. I have to thank my colleague Jim Jarecki from the Chicago Maritime Museum for reminding me of this view. This is the Great Chicago Flood of 1847. It is by far the earliest vessel view ever made. We know that steamer in the background is the sidewheeler Globe, because there's also a woodcut engraving that was made of this scene, which was a little more detailed from a slightly different daguerreotype that no longer survives. And you can see the qualities of it. It's pretty stark. Many daguerreotypes looked like this that were made outside. This one's a little overexposed. And unfortunately, I just have the picture. They cropped the case out of it, but it is cased. So Chicago, 1847, the earliest Great Lakes vessel photo known. The flood had washed a lot of schooners and steamers down the river and piled them up all in a corner of the river. The next view that we know about is, we actually have two views of it. It's the wreck of the sidewheel steamer Mayflower at Conneaut, Ohio, in the fall of 1852. And here you see the two views of her. The view on the lower right, it was in the collection at the Dawson Museum in Detroit, and unfortunately it was stolen. Somebody broke into the safe, took the $50 of petty cash out, as well as a number of other valuable things that included this daguerreotype, and they threw it in a dumpster, and it was lost forever. But fortunately, Pat Labadie had made a copy of it photographically, and here you see it. This view is made from the bluff. You can tell by the smokestacks, this one on the top left is also the same view, but made from the beach. This was sent to me by a collector on the East Coast named James Rutkowski a few years ago. And so this is the earliest known view we have of a shipwreck, although the Mayflower was recovered and sailed again after this. But this represents a very early view. And here you can see a daguerreotype case, typical case on top, where the photo is developed onto a copper plate with chemicals, and then they case it, largely because the chemicals do degrade over time and from moisture and can rub off the plate if you touch them. This is a really, really rare view. This is an albumin. I believe this is at the Chicago Historical Society. This is the first grain elevator at Chicago, and it's the Munger elevator, and it shows a schooner. Very, very rare for schooners to be photographed as a subject before the 1870s. And I wish we could identify this one. This photo is definitely pre-Civil War, probably 1858-ish. And it's an ambrotype, and you can tell that because of the amber coloration. This was developed on a glass plate. Ambrotypes were on glass, and this one has a beautiful case around it. Obviously, these pictures were all small, by the way. These were something that could fit in the palm of your hand. This is quite a blow-up of it. And usually they were in a little folding case that could close. So this one is, if anybody can recognize the schooner, obviously it's an early one. And lastly, we have a tin type here. This is also from the collection of James Rutkowski. This is the Boscobel. And this is just after 1860, probably just before the end of the Civil War. And this shows her in ice. This is cased in gutta percha. And tin types were cheaper to make. They often, made them at, county fairs and things like that. They were not expensive, although this one seems to have survived well. They were a little less durable, so I'm told. We have very few examples of tin types or ambrotypes or daguerreotypes, to be quite frank, on the lakes. I would bet that we have probably less than 20 known cased photos of Great Lakes vessels that have ever been found, and probably less than 40 vessel photos all told before the Civil War. They're very rare. We really don't have very many vessel photos until after the Civil War. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other types of views. So the cabinet card and the carte de visite, or CDV, are some other views that I've talked about. This is a later cabinet card that you see here. And why you can tell it's a cabinet card is it's, a fairly small view. It's albumin paper. You can tell because it's sepia toned a little bit, and it's pasted onto cardboard with a little pseudo frame around it. The CDV was invented really around 1860, and they were small. There aren't many vessel photos, again, on CDVs until much later. The cabinet card followed suit about 10 years later. And the difference is cabinet cards are usually oblong. They're a little larger. They also usually bear the stamp of the photography studio on them. And again, they usually were used for portraiture. But occasionally we'll see one with a vessel in it prior to 1870. Again, I'd say there's less than 100 of those known prior to 1870. Here is one of them. This is the steamer Lawrence at Chicago. And this is obviously a carte de visite, very small. They have glued the albumin print onto, sort of a pseudo frame cardstock here. And these are, again, quite rare. This was probably not made to be sold, in large quantity. It was probably made only in a few copies, maybe for the captain of the vessel or for, crew. Here we have what's more common. Now, this is a later cabinet card, and this shows the steamer Athabasca, I think right around the turn of the century. She had been in a collision coming up towards the Sioux and still had a big chunk of the other vessel's deck along with her capstan riding on her bow. This was done by W.J. Bell at the Sioux, and it's part of a series. There were about 10 of these, I guess. And you can also see it's, again, an albumin print that's been glued onto, black cardstock. And this is a larger imperial size view, which are more common. But we had these sort of pictures that were, made with glass plate negatives and printed on albumin and glued onto cardstock, mostly between 1880 and 1920. After 1920, we started to get more traditional gelatin silver photos. All right, probably the most important thing I want to talk about are Stereopticon views, because that's really where the early photos mostly come from. Stereopticon views really started in 1860, but we don't really see a lot of them on the lakes until 1865, until the end of the Civil War. Stereopticon views came in two different, time periods. There were the classic period between 1860 and 1885, where wet plate albumin stereo views were made. That's stereo views that were usually flat, that the pictures were printed in albumin, so they were sepia toned. and they were made by, sort of a wet process. They were made usually by local photographers in fairly small quantities. Beginning in about 1885, some companies such as Underwood and Keystone started to mass-produce stereopticon views using a dry plate lithography process where they would use just regular dry gelatin silver film and mass-produce the cards. And you could buy them from the Sears catalog, by the 100. Those are not very valuable. They're worth $10 to $15 a piece, and you can still buy them pretty cheap. However, the early ones are quite valuable. Here we see a W.H. Sherman view of Milwaukee. This is taken at the elevator A, which is now near the site of the Harley-Davidson Museum, and you see a really rare view of a barkentine, a three-masted barkentine. I think possibly the Tanner, in front of the grain elevator, and you can see that it's got tremendous detail. If you zoom in on it, it's really quite a detailed view. Likewise, we have another very rare view here. This is by A.K.A. Liebich, who was based in Cleveland, and he was at a shipyard, and these are some of the earliest views we have of a Great Lakes vessel being built. Here you see an arch-sided steamer. We don't know which one she was, but she's clearly under construction here. I wish I owned this one. I do not. It sold, I think last year for about $300. I got beat out. From the same series is a really beautiful view of the FC Card on the ways. I believe this is about 1864, making it quite early. She is shown amidst this sea of masts, and again, a really, really nice view of a shipyard. And I think what we have here, also by Liebich, is a view of that same steamer from the first slide, but here we see a derrick set up, and they're lowering what appears to be either her steam boiler or her engine into her from the derrick. And again, a very nice clear view. So these are some really, really rare views. I haven't seen another shipyard view this early from the 1860s. All right, a couple other interesting facts about stereo views. There were many small makers at small ports. This is Stephen Truesdell's stereo view that was made in Kenosha in 1866 about. And this shows this mosquito fleet in Kenosha Harbor drying their sails after a storm. Views like this are quite valuable, especially from smaller makers. A couple of things we can tell by looking at this view. We can tell it's an early view, primarily because it has square panels. The earlier equipment for making Stereopticon slides came with these square panels. That's not to say that curved top panels weren't available, as you could see with Liebich, but and it also doesn't mean that the view is necessarily always early. It just means that the person was using earlier equipment. So Truesdell made this view, and it's quite rare. I think I own the only known copy of this. There is a second view Truesdell made from a different angle of this that I've seen before, but very rare. All right, this is another really nice view by H.H. Bennett, who was a Wisconsin Stereopticon maker. He was most famous for making views of the Wisconsin Dells, but he did this view of the Milwaukee River Boneyard, or the Menominee River Boneyard at Milwaukee. This is the same grain elevator that you saw in the W.H. Sherman view. Just in back of it, they had a boneyard, and this is the schooner Honest John with the schooner Buena Vista to its left, and they were left there to rot about 1880. This was taken about 1884. These views are quite valuable. Bennett made a number of really nice views of the Wolf and Davidson shipyard all around 1880 to 1885 that are really nice. This is probably the rarest stereo view that I know of, and one of the earliest that shows a ship loss. This is Eagle Harbor, Michigan on the Keweenaw Peninsula. This picture was taken August 17th, 1865. It is the burning of the sidewheel steamer Traveler, and one of the passengers on the vessel was able to snap this photo. They had rushed everyone off the vessel and pushed her out into the harbor, and she lodged on the far shore where she burned to a total loss. And in fact, her remains are still there. I've shown my side scan imagery of her. You can actually see her name still on her side box here in this blow up on the bottom as she burns. I believe the original of this is owned by Superior View Studios, probably in Marquette. I don't own it, but it is a tremendously important historical view, and it shows an example of a stereo view that was made probably a one of a kind by a producer on site with a stereo view camera, and he probably made this. He made one of these. I've never seen another. A few other stereo views before we move on. This is a view by James Carbett, John Carbett, the Chicago view maker, taken at Peshtigo, Wisconsin. This, I believe, might be the bark Peshtigo, which was recently located off the Beaver Island, taken right around the end of the Civil War. You can see that she's still flying her square yards. You don't see many images of barks on the lakes. They disappeared really before about 1870. And lastly, this is a later Stereopticon view by William Whitesides, made at Duluth. Here we see beautiful detail on the stern of a schooner with another big schooner and a steamer in the background. And you can see this is a later view based on the nature of the vessels, but also it's on white stock with this border around it, which is a little bit fancier. The later the stereo view, the fancier they get. So probably 1880s, I would say. Now, I talked about the lithography post-1900 Stereopticon slides, and this is an example of 3 from my collection. These are fairly common. They tend to be fairly cheap. They were mass-produced. You do see these views a lot on eBay. The sellers tend to not understand the difference between the wet plate, really valuable views from the Civil War and these sort of later post-1900, mass-produced views. Here you have a big ore boat underneath the chutes at Cleveland. You got a view in the Sioux Locks here of the whaleback steamer Colgate, and then on the bottom we have a big schooner going through the Welland Canal. So it's a good cross section of the lakes, and I like to collect a few of these. They are going up in price, so they're nice to collect just because they're not very expensive, and they do show some excellent early views, and they tend to be very sharp, clean photos. So they're nice to collect. All right. Let's talk about some stereo view makers. I'm not going to read through this whole list for you, but suffice it to say that just about every port on the lakes had a Stereopticon view maker in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and most had multiples. And so, if you see a Stereopticon view, about half the time they'll have the maker's name on them, and you can use that name to tell how old they are. A lot of times these makers were only active for a few years, and so they're a good way of dating. However, I would caution that a lot of Stereopticon view makers sold their views to other makers who then printed them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the maker made the view. It just means that they reprinted it perhaps because they bought the negative, the glass plates, from another maker. And sometimes they were just flat out stolen. Some of the bigger, American Scenery, for example, series of cards, just took other makers' cards and pirated them. So be aware of that. But these are the primary makers on the Great Lakes. All right. Let's talk about glass plates. They were later, a lot of famous views of Great Lakes vessels that come from glass plate negatives. There really are 3 sources for most of the early glass plate negatives of vessels on the lakes. And by these I mean views that were made between about 1890, after the heyday of the stereo view and the cabinet card, and about 1920. Most of the views that I come across that are new or that people don't know about come from newspaper archives. So places like the Detroit Free Press or the Chicago Tribune maintained an archive of their glass plate negatives. Here you see one from the Chicago Tribune. This is the steamer Racine in ice off Racine, Wisconsin, I think about 1913. And you can see it's a glass plate. The emulsion is starting to degrade a little bit off the glass. And they usually look something like this when they come out of an archive. And there are many of these from different news outlets. Many of them are also archived at the Library of Congress and at other museums and libraries. So a good place to look for them. But there were two other really, really prominent photographers who actually were the first Great Lakes photographers to specifically target vessels. The most famous of these is Louis Pesce. Pesce was a very prolific photographer at Marine City, Michigan. Here you see the only known photo of him taking an image of a vessel. This is his car outside of his studio. And here you see a good example of his work on the St. Clair River, which is where he primarily photographed vessels. Between about 1895 and 1910, Pesce probably photographed between 1,000 and 2,000 different vessels on the Great Lakes. You can tell his glass plate negatives because they have the white lettering on them, which you saw also on the view of the Racine in ice. And they will. He probably made 30% of all the known vessel photos we have from that era. However, another even more prolific person was Andrew Young. And Andrew Young was based at the Canadian Soo, and he probably made more images even than Pesce. This is an iconic image made by Pesce of the L.R. Doty passing through the locks about 1897. Young would go down and take photos of every vessel that came through. And so if you see a photo of a ship in the locks like this, it's almost certainly Young. Young, when he passed away, his collection ended up being bought by a railroad collector, ephemera collector named Andrew Merrilees. And Merrilees has his entire collection at the National Archives of Canada in Ottawa. So if you want to find Andrew Young's work, it's there. I have a full catalog of all of his prints that is still generally in circulation. He really is an important maker. Most of the collections of vessel pictures around the Great Lakes are either Pesce or Young from the early era. So, of course, these glass plate photographers continued right up through about the 1920s, but then they were kind of throwbacks, sort of like film cameras are today. You know, most of us are shooting digital. But in 1884, Eastman, developed dry gel film, and so it slowly caught on. It made inroads, but what really kind of sounded the death knell for glass plates was the Brownie camera, which came out in 1900. And here you see a Brownie camera. It's a lightweight, simple little camera. And over here is a page from a scrapbook I have from the Great Lakes Naval Auxiliary Fleet. In their 1915 cruise, and one of the sailors had a Brownie camera, and he shot pictures all the way from Duluth to Buffalo, New York, and back. And you see the quality of imagery you get from a Brownie camera. These are very small photos, but they could take larger ones. A lot of photos were then made by just common people because it put the ability to take photos in the hands of the public. Another kind of view that I want to mention, I'd be remiss if I didn't, are magic lantern slides. These also come from the early 1900s. They were made in smaller quantities. You can still buy them on eBay. They ask about $40, $50 a piece. Here you see the Huronic. But one of the things you notice is that the quality of the image is really good. It's very detailed. These were made usually with dry plates, but they're just very crisp. I don't own any. I've been tempted to buy some, but I would have to scan them all in. But magic lantern slides have some really cool views if you can get them. Lastly, I'm going to talk about postcard images. So after 1900, beginning about 1902, postcards really replaced the Stereopticon view as the way to make, mass-produced photos. And they added an additional dimension in that they started to colorize them. Here we see a view of the whaleback steamer Christopher Columbus before they added her second deck and in her original white colors. This is taken at Racine around the turn of the century. And it's beautifully colorized, and it gives you an idea of just how nice some of the photos on these postcards could be. Most of the postcard images were made with dry plate, lithography, and then colorized and transferred onto the card. Although some came from glass plates. This is one that did. This is a postcard view of a schooner ashore at Sheboygan, Wisconsin, probably around 1910. And it's quite clear, and you can see it's sepia tinted, so it's on albumin color, and it's not colorized. So they printed this onto a postcard, and using the old method. Here are a couple of nice colorized ones. These were obviously taken off of photos. These are 2 shipwrecks at Sheboygan in about 1910 that had already started to degrade after maybe only 10 or 20 years. So some good examples of what postcards look like. You can really tell how old a postcard is, not just by the subject matter or the post or the stamp on it, but also if it's a split back, then you know pretty accurately the date, because those started at a very specific date. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the major collectors. These guys were really important because without them, we wouldn't have most of these photos. The 2 most important early collectors that left us the largest group of photos were Captain Ed Karras and Herman Runge. Now, they weren't themselves photographers, but they collected images. You see Herman Runge in the upper right. He was a really unusual character. I think if he was around today, we would say he was on the spectrum. My friend Henry Barkhausen actually knew Herman Runge and borrowed some of his materials one time, and Henry said that Runge was one of the most unusual and eccentric characters he ever met. He filled his house with material. Marine registers, news clippings. He had a huge catalog card index of every vessel that ever sailed the lakes. He had every marine register ever made. And unfortunately, in 1958, his house caught fire because you literally couldn't walk through it. It was so full of material. And the Wisconsin Marine Historical Society was formed as a result, and they transferred his whole collection to the Milwaukee Public Museum in several truckloads. And it's still there, and it's been built upon since then. Likewise, Ed Karras was active around the same time, 1930s, 40s, 50s. Karras was a little older than Runge. The 2 men knew each other and competed. Didn't always get along. But Karras had been a sailor on Great Lakes schooners and was a living legacy of that era. He donated all of his photos to the Wisconsin Maritime Museum at Manitowoc, where they've also continued to build on his collection, and they've digitized most of his photos, and they're now online. So 2 very important early collectors. The next 4 collectors are what I would call modern collectors in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Rick Wright is probably the earliest of them. He unfortunately passed away much too soon. His vast collection served as the kind of basis for the historical collections of the Great Lakes at Bowling Green State University. And many of those images that are online in their searchable database come from Rick Wright. But probably the largest collection, certainly the most complete for 19th century vessels, is that of Pat Labadie. Pat's collection was built over the course of his long career, first at the Dawson Museum in Detroit, later at the Canal Park Museum in Duluth, and finally at the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary in Alpena. His collection is now at the Alpena Public Library. Pat traveled all over the lakes with an actual camera apparatus and made photographic reproductions of every steamer photo he could find, and many schooners as well. And he has them all in binders, now on a big shelving system there. They've all been digitized and are in a searchable database. He has thousands and thousands of early photos. I would say he has 80% of all the vessels that have ever been photographed from the 1900s or the 1800s. However, just because a photo doesn't exist in Labadie's collection doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We found many photos that weren't there because things still continue to turn up. The next 2 guys, Ralph Roberts and Ken Throw, were contemporaries of Labadie's, or I should say are. Ralph's collection I think he still has. Ken's is largely at the Jim Dan Hall Library at UW Superior. They did similar work to Labadie, where they traveled all over and collected and reproduced photos. They have many photos that Labadie doesn't, both of them, and they each have photos that each other don't have. they're some very important collectors, and eventually I think their photos will all end up at institutions and then being digitized. All right, the last three are modern collectors, kind of my contemporaries and friends. Walter Lewis, Bill Lafferty, and myself are some of the people that are still out there turning up new images, new historical images. And the three of us have found many things that are not in the other collections, but we make them available widely. We donate them where we can and make sure that they're digitized. And the three of us really enjoy it as a hobby. And we don't try to collect images of every vessel. We try to find new and important images and to tell their stories. So, all right. A couple of guidelines I want to give people who are looking for photos. I often get these requests for photos from the 1830s and 40s. Honestly, less than 40 images of Great Lakes vessels are known from before the Civil War. And also, most of the vessel photos that we have from the 1800s are not from these CDVs or cabs. They're not from cardstock. They're from stereo views. We really don't have very many vessels that were photographed from the 1800s. Less than 60% of the vessels that were on the lakes in the 1800s were ever photographed. So if the rule of thumb is, if you're looking for a vessel photo and the vessel was built before 1880 and it's not a major passenger steamer, it probably doesn't exist. If you look at my graph below, what this is helpful for is finding out what type of photo is likely to exist. So say you're looking at 1880. You're not looking for an ambro type or a tin type. You're probably looking for a Stereopticon view. Maybe a cabinet card might exist, not a postcard, and certainly it would have to be something from a glass plate. So, just as a guideline. And probably by 1880, only 40% of, maybe even less, 35% of the vessels on the Great Lakes had been photographed at that point, because nobody was seeking out and trying to catalog vessels. These Stereopticon makers were not trying to make vessel photos. They were making photos that would sell, harbor views, things like that. Occasionally they might take a good side view of a steamer, but really they were trying just to make commercially saleable views. So it wasn't really until the late 1890s that photographers started to really try to document every vessel on the lakes. All right. How do we date a photo? The big question I always ask about a photo is it an original mount or is it a reproduction? And by that I mean, is this a picture of a picture? Is this one of something Pat Labadie made or somebody made with a photographic apparatus? Or do you have an actual albumen mounted on cardstock, or is it in a case? You can usually tell. And even if it's a later paper print, you hold it up to the light, you can tell if it's modern paper. Or you can look at the emulsion qualities, and you can often tell, is it color? Is it, can you tell that it's a print, basically, of a print, because they start to degrade in quality. So if it's cased, obviously it's Civil War or earlier, a DAG, a tin type, an ambro type. You can always tell a stereotype because it's got two pictures on it, but you can always tell if it is curved. If it's not flat, if it's curved, it's a later stereo view made with the dry mount process, probably after 1890. If it's flat, and if it's color, if the cardboard is orange or red or yellow, it's almost certainly one of the early, more valuable views. Pre-1875, pre-1880. For card mounts like CDVs and cabinets, you want to check the size. Smaller card mounts are earlier. The ones that have the maker name on them, the cabinet cards are generally later, 1870s, 1880s. Check the paper it's printed on. If the albumen paper that's glued onto that card is, really thick, it's probably later. The early albumens were really thin. For paper prints, you want to look at the paper stock. How thick is it? Is it thicker? A lot of the early paper stock from early photos was very thick. And the emulsion qualities, a lot of times they were kind of brownish in tint, particularly if they're from, a brownie camera. And lastly, look for clues in the image, obviously. Vessel names and types. If you're looking at a very early arch-sided steamer, the picture's probably not from after 1900. You can often spot, very fuzzy names, but you can make out enough to know how long the name is, or if it's a compound name. Look on top of the pilot house. Some of them had had ornamentation that you can tell, sort of what it is. I also count the stanchions and the arches on the sides of steamers, or look at the window configuration on the steamers. That also helps to identify the steamer and therefore identify the date of the photo. Likewise, you can look for buildings and landscape features in the photo. That's really helpful. Where there was that bridge built yet? Were there trees there at that time? And lastly, people often forget to look at what are people wearing? Do the ladies have those big Victorian dresses? Do the guys have derby hats on? That can help to date a photo as well. So, a couple of suggestions. All right. Considerations for collectors. If you collect photos, even modern ones that you want to save, keep them in protective sleeves. That's what I do. I keep mine in Mylar sleeves. Don't expose them to direct sunlight. When you see those Stereopticons that are faded and you can hardly see what was on them anymore, that's because they were exposed to sunlight. Keep them out of sunlight. Keep an inventory. Keep a spreadsheet or a database. Otherwise, you end up buying the same thing twice. Or, if they get damaged in a fire, you'll need to know for insurance purposes. Don't store in damp or humid conditions. They get mildewy. They start to develop wrinkles and bubbles. Make sure they're in a nice dry environment where the humidity doesn't change much. Also, store rare and early photos in archival boxes. You'd be surprised, like cardboard off gases as it decomposes, and it can stain the photos over time. Keep them in archival boxes that don't decompose and are not acidic. Minimize handling and removal from protective sleeves. A lot of Stereopticon views, the albumin is, where it's glued on, the glue's starting to go and the corners are coming up, and it catches on the side of the Mylar and can chip or damage the actual photo. So be careful of that. And also don't touch the photos, don't handle them. It can, chip, rub off. You'd see abrasions on some of them. These last 2 points are really important. Digitize your entire collection. If Pat Labadie hadn't digitized that view of the Mayflower, we wouldn't have it anymore. And lastly, share your images digitally with public collections. A lot of my materials at Alpina and the Labadie database. Some of it's on Walt Lewis's site. Some of it's at Wisconsin Maritime Museum. I've really been trying to donate as much as possible if I have something that's important. All right. If you're looking for, say you don't want to collect them yourself, but you need to find photos, major Great Lakes photo collections. Obviously, the Labadie collection at the Alpena Public Library is a really important one. UW Superior has the Canal Park and the Kenneth Rowe collections, and a lot of other really interesting stuff. If you get a chance to go there to the Jim Dan Hall Library, check it out. A really important regional collection is at Bowling Green State University, at the Historical Collections of the Great Lakes. They build on it regularly. It contains some of the rarest and most important collections. Likewise, the Runge collection, which they've continued to build at the Milwaukee Public Library, is accessible. The Karras collection has been largely digitized now at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, and you can look at it online. Obviously, Dawson in Detroit has a really important collection of early Great Lakes vessel photos. One a lot of people don't know about is the Clark Library at Central Michigan University. I think Chuck Feltner donated his materials there, and they have a lot of really good early photos from that part of the state. And lastly, for Canadian stuff, the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston is a really important repository, and I would encourage people, if you get to that part of the world, check it out. All right. This is just a view of my collection, some of my Stereopticons that I had out the other day. You can see they're all in cases, and I packed them up right away before they could fade from the sunlight. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. If you want me to give this talk at your organization, I am happy to do so after the plague lifts. I'm recording this during December, and obviously I'm not leaving the house. So I hope you found this presentation useful. If you turn up any early views, or if you have any questions about early Great Lakes vessel photos that you might have, or harbor photos, don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks for watching, everybody, and have a nice evening.